Galileo said, "All truths are easy to understand once they are discovered. The point is to discover them." This is the story of the discovery of a very simple truth in biology. I used to teach Richard Dawkins. He gave me as a gift a signed copy of The Selfish Gene shortly after it came out. So as you can imagine, I'm really rather interested in biology and evolution. Some people think there are flaws to Charles Darwin's theory. I used to catch a train at the same time every week and used to look at some weeds growing in a crack between a wooden post and some surrounding concrete. Then it suddenly hit me. Right there, before my eyes, was a real live experiment that proved everything Darwin had ever had to say. I designed a controlled experiment based on those weeds. If science has anything to teach, it's about the power of impossible things. Galileo said, "Imagine a ball rolling along at constant velocity. That," he said, "is impossible." With that simple idea, he gave birth to modern science. Galileo's impossible rolling ball allows us to look at real balls in the real world and explain their behavior. They are material bodies with mass and inertia. We soon arrive at Newton's laws of motion. If anyone ever finds Galileo's impossible ball, nothing in science will have any foundation. There'll be no explanation for cell phones, computers, or the internet, and no basis for making new discoveries. That's the power of first imagining impossible things and then figuring out the consequences. So let's try turning things around. Let's disagree with Charles Darwin. Let's say he's wrong and his claims are impossible. In which case we can ask ourselves, what properties must biological organisms then demonstrate instead, or else fail to demonstrate? And, as soon as it's expressed that way, it becomes immediately clear that a biological organism free from Darwinian evolution is precisely as impossible as one of Galileo's rolling balls. An impossible biological entity is certainly going to use energy. So, what is energy? Thomson was the first to link biological organisms directly to work and energy. He said, "I cannot begin to describe the surprise and astonishment expressed in the faces of the bystanders on seeing so large a quantity of cold water heated and actually made to boil without any fire." He had just arranged for some horses to march round and round a cannon surrounded by water for 2.5 hours. The frictional force had had the identical effect to lighting a fire. He was the first to demonstrate the interconvertibility of energy and to calculate the mechanical equivalent of heat. This is now enshrined in the first law of thermodynamics. The total work those horses did included their respiration and other biological processes. Thomson, of course, did not think to measure that energy, and could not have measured it even if he had. We, however, can do both. The first law of thermodynamics says that we can always attach a living organism to a device in some unspecified gravitational field somewhere, and then suck out all its energy and use it to boil some water, just like Thomson did, and then keep it on the boil, or simply keep some arbitrary weight suspended at some suitable height in some arbitrary gravitational field. We can continue this for as long as the organism is alive. As soon as it dies, then either our suspended weight falls or our water cools down. This is how energy is defined. This is how energy is measured. Every crumb of energy in this universe, even when contained in living tissue, can either help us boil water somewhere, or else help us suspend a weight somewhere in some gravitational field, or else a little bit of both, entirely depending upon what we want to do with it. Now that we are clear what energy is, we can say the first important things about these impossible biological entities. We know they're going to use energy, which we know can always be siphoned off to either support a weight in a gravitational field, or else to invest in raising the temperature of some heat pump. We do not want these entities to evolve, so each one must grow, or otherwise, generation by generation, they will all get smaller. This gives us the first law of biology. Our entities must also interact with some planet and its atmosphere. The reality of death for all of them is surely beyond dispute. Therefore, dust to dust and ashes to ashes, even our impossible entities will be in competition with the Earth. They take the Earth's resources, then the Earth wants them back. But some will also eat others, and some will hunt. All this gives us our first maxim of ecology. We may have denied evolution, but even organisms free from it will be allocated to species. We need some basis for such allocations. Thus we have our second law of biology. But we also need a way to explain biological diversity both within and between species. Young and adults differ. Worker ants and bees differ from their queens. But no matter what these differences, even impossible to exist organisms must respire and must undertake certain minimum survival processes. We can cover all this with a third law of biology. More babies are born in towns than in villages because towns have more people. Reddy made the first serious attack on the old theory of spontaneous generation. He had the revolutionary belief that maggots developed from the eggs that flies laid. So he placed some meat in some flasks, with some open to the air, others covered with gauze, and others sealed. Maggots only appeared in the open ones where flies could lay their eggs. Pasteur's, however, was the definitive rebuttal experiment. He boiled some meat broth in a flask to kill all microorganisms, heated the flask's neck, and bent it into an S shape. Air could now enter the flask, while the microorganisms fell into the S bend. When Pasteur tilted the flask and let the broth run back into the neck, microorganisms grew. The more flies there were in Reddy's experiment, the greater the number of maggots that appeared, and the more microorganisms there were in the air with Pasteur, the more were reproduced, which now gives us the second maxim of ecology. A blue whale needs considerably more components and also far more time to build itself than does a mosquito. The whale is removing a far greater number of components from the earth, which takes far longer. This gives us our third maxim of ecology. Even an impossible entity must increase the number of its chemical bonds and components and grow from young to old before it can reproduce. It is also essential that it develops in whatever way is appropriate for that species. The nature of its chemical process may not change, but if it needs rain and or sun and or carbon and or any other components, and these happen to be in short supply, then its chemical process is going to take longer to complete or require more energy or both. This leads to the fourth maxim of ecology. Worker ants and bees might be sterile and might not in themselves reproduce, but their colonies have queens which do. We can therefore complete our set of laws with the fourth law of biology, which covers all such cases and defines reproduction. We now have a set of very simple laws and maxims which must be exhibited by any biological entity whatever, even by an impossible one seeking to be free from Darwinian competition and Darwinian evolution. And just as Galileo's imaginary situation allows exact values to be assigned to all objects with mass and inertia, so also do these four laws and four maxims. They also tell us that all biological entities must abide by three principles or constraints. The constraint of constant propagation declares that if even one species becomes extinct, then Darwinian competition and evolution exist. The constraint of constant size means that if even one species shows a change in the size of its population between one generation and the next, then Darwinian competition and evolution exist. The constraint of constant equivalence means that if even one species anywhere has more young than it has old, which is exactly what Darwin observed, then Darwinian competition and evolution exist. The experiment I designed gives exact values to these three principles. Just as Galileo's ever-rolling ball is impossible, then these four laws and maxims, along with the principles or constraints, show that what Charles Darwin said is true, and that it is utterly impossible for there to be any biological entity or species whatever that is free from Darwinian competition and evolution. And that's the power of first imagining impossible things and then working out the consequences.